You can see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for letting me know. I am really excited to be presenting this research again today. Quite a long time after I defended it for my dissertation, and I must admit I'm feeling a lot less stressed today. So I know quite a few of you actually, but for those of you who don't know me, I am Susan Fawcett, and I'm the Director of Therapy, Behavior, and Family Support at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation. I have been here for over 17 years now. For the first 10, I was the head speech language pathologist. And I've moved into this new role kind of alongside completing my PhD. And I am really happy to be a part of the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation. I will just show you some of the partners who are involved in this study. So you can see DSRF is definitely was a big part of it. I ran the research project here. I was also very blessed to have wonderful committee members at UBC, Pat, of course, and Joe Lucician and Bruno Zumbo. And I couldn't have done the project without help from a doctoral research award through CIHR. It allowed me to help a lot more families, certainly. And just a little bit about DSRF, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization. We're located in Burnaby. We have been around for, well, I will put this in air quotes, we celebrated our 25th anniversary this year. And, you know, hopefully we'll actually be able to have a real celebration at some point. But you know, for now, this'll have to do, doing it this kind of COVID way. But we're primarily a service delivery organization. So we see kids from birth to adulthood across the lifespan, because kids with Down syndrome have developmental disabilities, you know, that cross all developmental areas. We have SLPs, OTs, we have lots of teachers here. Our program staff now numbers about 12 people, which is exciting because when I first started, it was really just me. So yeah, I think that's about all I have to say about DSRF. Normally, I would invite people who hadn't been here to come visit, but of course, that's not the best idea right now. But as soon as COVID is over, please come and have a visit for sure. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background and rationale first to start. So many children with Down syndrome have behavioral health issues, and unfortunately, this is actually not well recognized through the general public. So, you know, a lot of our kids have secondary diagnoses such as autism, which I'll get to talking about a little bit more in a few minutes. But most of the time, it's kind of just enough to negatively impact their ability to learn and to participate in the routines of everyday life. I was very thankful when this recent study came out because it finally sort of said, they based this on about 300 children, that 94% of the kids with Down syndrome had at least one kind of problem behavior that was frustrating for their parents. And the most common problem behaviors that they reported in kids with Down syndrome were non-compliance, sitting down and refusing to move, wandering or running away from adults, and aggression, which look a little bit different from, you know, problem behaviors that surface in typically developing kids. And, you know, as an SLP who had worked with these kids before I started my PhD, I had worked with these kids for 10 years, and I kind of had a good grasp, I think, on how to help them with speech and language and social skills. I really often couldn't get to those things because the underlying behavior problems were really getting in the way. And that's what brought me to doing a PhD in the first place. And then the other rationale piece for this particular study was that there are some gaps in the research literature. So currently, there was no research that had examined a secondary prevention or tier 2 model of family-centered positive behavior support. So prior to this study, all 28 studies out there on family-centered positive behavior support were really done at the individualized level. And then Alarmingly, I found this really surprising. Out of those 28 studies, there wasn't one person in there with Down syndrome. Of course, it was, a lot had autism. A lot of the participants in those studies had autism, but there were all sorts of other genetic disorders that were represented, but Down syndrome being the most common cause of intellectual disability was not. So I found that really surprising. So because this is a crowd who, is pretty into the autism stuff, I thought I would spend just a little bit of time talking about this dual diagnosis of Down syndrome and autism spectrum disorder. So it's actually quite common for a child with Down syndrome to have an additional diagnosis of autism. So up to 18% of kids. That's certainly what we see. That's, number that's reported in the research literature, but that's certainly about what we see here at DSRF clinically as well. And there is a great deal of overlap between Down syndrome and autism. And really interestingly, when you talk to people who do this for a living, who diagnose autism, and they often have to do it in kids with Down syndrome, or even in the research literature, people often use words like, the child had an autistic flavor. I had a gut feeling that there was something else going on, and it kind of looked like autism. There was a lot of, there's a lot of talk about feel in terms of these, in terms of the diagnosis. And so it's really tricky to diagnose, because it's much more a qualitative difference than kind of a measurable one. But one area we can really concentrate on are differences in the area of social development. Those are really key for looking at the diagnosis, because, while I would never say that a child with Down syndrome, or that children with Down syndrome in general are strong socially, that would be incorrect, because they definitely still struggle with many social skills. I think, they do have a relative strength compared to other domains of development. And so there, just some examples here. We know that kids with Down syndrome alone are really fantastic at imitating motor movements and verbal things, and that doesn't tend to be true of the kids who are dually diagnosed. And then another one is that kind of that kids are really, really interested in interacting socially just for the pure joy of the social interaction. That's true of a child with Down syndrome alone, but not so true of a child who has a dual diagnosis. And then another difference, by way of an example, is that a child with a dual diagnosis of DS-ASD will often prefer to interact with objects to people. And of course, that's really not true of a child with just Down syndrome alone. They're definitely people. So those are some of the things. There's many other things too that you can look at. And if you want a little bit more information about this, we've actually you'll see on the bottom of the screen there, we've just started a page on our website just in the last year or so, because there are so many of these families, where we are essentially looking at putting some information out there, so that people can, look at the differences and the different struggles that may come up if a child is dually diagnosed. Another thing that we will soon be doing, of course, COVID got in the way of this a little bit, but we are hoping to start doing some parent groups for parents of kids who are dually diagnosed, because often what we hear from these parents, unfortunately, is that they really feel like they don't fit into either group. So they, will go to parent groups or play groups with parents of kids with just Down syndrome, and they don't feel like they fit there. They'll go to conferences about autism and they feel like they don't fit there. And so I think there's quite a gap here that hopefully we're going to be able to cover a little bit. And so just heading into the next piece here about the program for this study, one of the main drivers was around this funding piece. So funding for therapies, including behavioral therapies for kids with autism. in BC is quite robust. You know, there's a dollar amount that you get every year for a set number of years. And in contrast, there's sparse funding available in BC for behavioral therapies for children who have Down syndrome. So, you know, there's even SLP and OT are not always funded for kids who have Down syndrome, and parents often have to pay out of pocket. And so we thought, what might be a good idea is to have a less expensive, more preventative, aimed at really young kids kind of program that would be less costly for these families. And so for our secondary prevention model of family-centered positive behavior support, we thought a good thing to try might be a 14-week group-delivered parent training program focused on teaching PBS strategies to families of young children with Down syndrome and mild to moderate levels of problem behavior. So a few of the research questions, the first couple are the ones I'm going to talk mostly about today, and I'm going to present the results for these two. And there's a few others too that I'll go through on the next slide. The first one is really a question about whether the parents were able to learn the strategies from the program. The second one was the main research question of the study, and that was, you know, did the group parent training program result in statistically significant decreases in child problem behavior, increases in child positive engagement in a routine, increases in parents' sense of parenting competence, decreases in parenting stress, and increases in family quality of life. And then in addition, we also talked about, we wanted to know if the experimental group was able to maintain the difference, if there was one. And, you know, did the waitlist control group also improve? So we kind of looked at a pre-post just for the waitlist control group. And then did the families view the approach as socially valid? And that I will actually talk a little bit about nearer the end. So this study that I'm going to talk about today was actually the last step so far anyway, in a process of integrated knowledge translation. And for those of you who don't know, this is essentially just having the people who are going to benefit from the research actually involved in the research itself. So in this case, that's families, right? So we started with a concept paper which described the need for a secondary prevention model of family-centered PBS, because there hadn't been one yet. And then we actually ran a little bit of a shorter program with 2 families and 1 professional. And in that stage 1 study, we got through focus groups. I got feedback from the families and the professional all the way through. And that informed this last version of the program, which was the one that was examined via a randomized controlled trial. So I'll move into method now. So just by way of overview, the next couple of slides just kind of give you an overview of what I'll be talking about, but I'm going to go into detail on all of these things. So the group parent training program, which was developed with lots of help, of course, from Pat and Joe, as well as Anne Turnbull, Glenn Dunlap, George Singer. So lots of people had a hand in making this a really great program. And the content of it was essentially this set of core empirically supported universal positive behavior support strategies. We taught the parents a regular mindfulness practice, how to change problematic thought patterns, and strategies for caring for the family as a whole. And then you can see in terms of process, we did have a bunch of different activities, definitely through each session. And the program was really heavily influenced by the active training process that's described in a really well researched and program, and it's widely available across the world as well, the Parent Management Training Oregon model. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that some more later too, but we were definitely very heavily influenced by their process style. And so the basic rule of thumb for the program was to make sure that for every 20 minutes of, I basically tried not to do what I'm doing to all of you today, which is talk at you for a really long time. So I basically tried to only do about 20 minutes of that. And then we'd have an active kind of component like role play or discussion or moving around the room, that kind of thing. So I will also point out here in terms of process, I did have help from a research assistant. So it was me and her that were running all of the sessions together. So again, by way of an overview, here's what the whole program looked like. If you look at all of it together. And then, so basically, we started a lot with introductions and this idea of like learning about why problem behavior occurs in the first place. Then by session 3, we started getting to some really foundational concepts. And then you'll see that it's really heavily prevention based. So we talk about preventative strategies pretty much right through till here, till session 10. So it's really heavy. Of course, we addressed preventative teaching and consequence strategies, but it was really heavily based in the prevention, on the prevention side. So in terms of how we started out, in the very first session, we covered functions of behavior. So the reasons why kids engage in problem behavior, those being our big 4, which are attention, escape, tangible, that's either an object or an activity of some kind, or automatic reinforcement. And then we also talked about the 4-term contingency. So the fact that behavior is dependent on lots of other things that are happening at various times. So setting events, antecedents, behavior, and consequences. In session 2, we delved a bit further into why problem behavior occurs. And this was talking about how unhealthy parent-child interactions develop over time, which are called coercive family processes. And these are basically, this is a really common pattern of parent-child interaction, especially in families who have kids with developmental disabilities, whereby ineffective parenting practices and child problem behavior essentially reinforce themselves. And it's an inadvertent thing, it's not intentional, but it does happen a lot. And so giving parents, some knowledge about that is, a lot of them found that quite helpful. We also, in that session, covered child and family strengths, because of course we always want to, in PBS, build from a place of strength. And so what we did in that session was we had parents basically write out all of the things that they thought were strengths for their particular child and them for a family as a whole. And then we posted those in the room and they were there for the whole time. In session 3, we got really more into foundational things. So mindfulness, changing problematic thought patterns, and giving praise to kids. So in terms of mindfulness, just by way of a little bit of a definition, mindfulness is paying attention to the present moment on purpose in a non-judgmental way. And typically that's done by paying attention to the breath, but it can be other things as well. And we know through a really heavy evidence base that, mindfulness is helpful for all sorts of things, anxiety, stress, depression, but also parenting. And there's studies that actually show that it's good for parents of kids with developmental disabilities as well. So basically, I like to think of it as there's a bunch of P's. So, it makes you have more presence during parenting tasks, more patience during parenting tasks, and actually be able to, instead of becoming really enmeshed and frustrated when your child is engaging in problem behavior, it allows you to step back and sort of problem solve through it a little bit better. So that's why we taught mindfulness to these parents. So we encourage them to engage in several days a week. I think I said 3 to 4 days a week if you can, for at least 5 minutes. And we taught them 4 mindfulness practices. One was sitting, so that was just sitting and paying attention to the breath. One that was walking, loving kindness and compassion abiding. And that last one is really helpful for if parents are experiencing a lot of anger towards their child or maybe their partner, which also definitely happens. So those were the 4 that we taught them. In terms of the problematic thought patterns, we taught parents about thinking traps, and that some thoughts that you have about your parenting style or about your child while you're watching them have a meltdown in a grocery store, for example, are unhelpful, and they sabotage your ability to parent effectively. And so we learned strategies around that as well. And then positive reinforcement of adaptive behavior via physical or verbal praise. So we know that, praise, this in positive reinforcement in the form of praise, is a really, really helpful way to build adaptive behavior. And that's especially true for kids with Down syndrome who are really socially motivated for the most part. And so, but the thing with this one is the reason why we moved it to the front of the program, even though it's a consequence-based strategy, was because it's actually really hard for parents to do this. So there's a lot of error patterns that happen when parents are giving praise to kids. And the biggest one is that they don't give enough of it. Right? So definitely moving that to the beginning and then us reinforcing it all the way through with every single example and reminding parents about it, I think made it more likely that they were going to actually use it. Then we headed into some of our prevention strategies. So starting with some Down syndrome specific setting events and supports and house rules. In terms of the DS specific issues, we know that kids with Down syndrome have all sorts of medical issues that need to be addressed because if you're in physical pain or discomfort or you're not seeing or hearing very well, then your behavior is not going to be very good. So that really underlies a lot of things. So we talked about making sure vision and hearing are corrected, reducing expectations. If your child is not feeling well, these are kids who are really prone to ear infections and respiratory illness. So really making sure, and gastrointestinal issues are another one that are really big. The other super, super important one, and Osman, I'm sure will be happy to hear me say this, is that sleep apnea is extremely common in kids and adults with Down syndrome. We know that it's a high percentage. And then of course, if you're not getting a good quality sleep, I'm sure all of us can relate to this. Our behavior the next day is not ideal, right? So we really wanted to make sure that assessment had happened for that for all of these kids and treatment as well. And then nutrition, similar to kids with autism, kids with Down syndrome do have a lot of, they also this is a bit unlike kids with autism, but they do have a lot of oral motor issues that contribute to difficulties sometimes with chewing and swallowing. And then on top of that, like children with autism, they have hypersensitivity to certain tastes and textures. And so nutrition is often not adequate. So we talked about strategies around that as well. And then house rules, you'll see there's an example of this in the corner of the screen, just one of the house rules posters that we came up with, a list of value-based rules for all children in the family to follow at home. And so this one, it was specific to what the parents made rules that were specific to what their children were, what they wanted them to do more of, basically. And so, hands and legs to yourself, quiet talking, using kind words. So this really helps to set up expectations for everybody in the household, all the kids in the household. Because one thing I learned, I'm going to tell you in a minute about going into everybody's house, and basically, I got a very intimate picture of what happens in households. And, sometimes, the kid with Down syndrome was engaging in problem behavior, sure, but the siblings sometimes were really engaging in a lot of behavior, which was not helpful at all. So this is a really good whole family approach. And so in session 5, we then talked about once you've set up these expectations, you have this nice poster up. Now we want to acknowledge it. So we want to do a bit of an acknowledgement system by way of, making tickets that are really, attractive that kids can put in a jar. And you'll see that in a video a little bit later on as well, that strategy being used. We also talked about in that session effective requests, so that there's a way of giving children instructions that makes it more likely that they'll actually comply with those instructions, given that, non-compliance is a huge problem for kids with Down syndrome. That was a really important one to cover. In session 6, we talked about caring for the whole family. So really, striving to keep all of the relationships in the family healthy. So what can you do as a couple that, will help you be able to parent better? And how can you have better relationships with your siblings? And how can you incorporate extended family and that sort of thing? In session 7, we talked about positive contingencies with visual supports. So visual supports such as pictures and symbols, we know that helps enhance predictability for children. We also know that kids with Down syndrome are much better at learning visually than they are auditorily. So it's really important to have things represented visually whenever possible. And then offering choices. So even within non-preferred activities, giving children a choice of a couple of options will often help them comply a little bit better. So session 8 was a little bit of a different animal because we didn't have a group training session that week. I actually went into everybody's home, and in their primary target routine, every family chose a routine. And I talked about, or I helped them actually deal with any issues that had come up in that routine now that they had learned a bunch of strategies. So what I did was I observed the parent carry out the routine, and I completed an implementation checklist that was specific to what they were doing. Afterwards, I asked them first to self-evaluate, and it's probably not surprising to anybody here, but most of the parents kind of they kind of were a bit hard on themselves, right? Like, oh, I forgot to do that, and I could have used this here, and all that kind of stuff. And then what was really interesting to me too is that some of the routines were already going much more smoothly by that time. But when I asked the parents about, why do you think the routine is going so much better, they attributed it all to their kid. So they would say things like, well, oh, she just like really learned this one thing so well, and I can't believe how well she's doing with this. And I had to kind of like, well, why do you think that is though? Don't you think you might have helped out with that a little bit? And then they would sort of very begrudgingly acknowledge that maybe they had played a role in that. So that was really interesting to me, for sure. I used the checklist then after they had self-evaluated to give them a lot of praise. So this was something that Pat talked to me about just before I started these coaching sessions. And I distinctly remember what she said to me. She said, Susan, you're going to go in there and you're going to praise the bejesus out of the parents. So that's what I did. I praised the bejesus out of them, which was actually pretty fun. And then a little bit of corrective feedback. So things that were going definitely quite, that weren't going well, I definitely pointed those things out, but it was very much heavy on the praise for sure. And then at the end of that session, we had time for discussion and problem solving. This was really important for a couple of the families because a couple of them obviously, not everybody is going to be doing swimmingly by session 8. So it was good as a check-in because we actually ended up having to add a couple of strategies for a couple of the families, something a little more specific. So this is where this is a secondary prevention model. It is a little bit individualized and not just a universal prevention model where I would just be giving them the information and not checking in with them or individualizing anything. You'll see an example actually of one of the extra strategies we added in one of the videos that I'm going to show you a little bit later. So In session 9, we talked about incorporating preferences. So this is basically building preferred elements into activities or routines that makes it more likely, routines that are hard, right? That makes it more likely that they'll complete it. And you can see in that picture there, hopefully, there's a huge number of stickers that incorporate probably most kids' preferences in some way. I mean, I did kind of check with it, but this is what we use to make the house rules tickets. And so this makes it more appealing to the kids, right? It makes them more willing to work for these tickets because they've got Elsa from Frozen, or the Paw Patrol guys were really popular at that time. And just, I thought I'd just bring up kind of a funny example too of incorporating preferences that's probably quite relevant to all of us right now. And that is, I'm sure a lot of us here, I mean, we all have to wear masks now, right? That's just part of the way life is right now. But a lot of us are wearing masks that, you know, look kind of fun, right? So just by way of an example, one of my OTs left me this one on my desk this morning. It's got Christmas things on it. They're dogs. These are both things I really like. I love Christmas and dogs. And so I will be more willing to wear a mask, which is not a preferred activity for most people, because I have cute dogs on it. Okay, so this, I mean, all of these things work for all of us, right? And then in terms of safety signals, this is teaching kids to tolerate delays before they get what they want, which is quite helpful for parents, obviously. So an example of that there, going with the Christmas theme again, you know, if you're eating Christmas dinner, for me, I don't really like Brussels sprouts. So maybe like eat 2 more Brussels sprouts and then you can have a fruit cake. Actually, I don't like fruit cake, so that wouldn't be a good reinforcer for me. Nanaimo bars. You can have Nanaimo bars after you eat 2 more Brussels sprouts. Okay, so, and then in session 10, we talked about building successful routines and transitions. In this session, parents were now given a generalization project. So that's where they had to take the strategies they were learning, and without a whole lot of help from me or the research assistant, they had to apply those strategies to another problematic routine. And they did it kind of on their own, and then they were to present this to the rest of us in the last session. And then we also talked about in that session why transitions are particularly challenging for children and how we could adapt some of the strategies to work in transition routines. Transitions being moving from, you know, breakfast to going out the door to school, right? Those kinds of things. In session 11, we covered play. So some parents are really good at playing with their kids. Some parents need a lot of help with this. And so it was a good thing to cover. I think not every parent sees the value in play. They feel like, especially I think kids with, or parents of kids with developmental disabilities, probably often feel like they have to be teaching all the time. Otherwise, how is my kid going to learn all the stuff he needs to learn? But getting them to learn how to teach through play and do that in a really fun way for the kid is really important for behavior. So we know that if parents regularly play with their kids, it improves parent-child interactions. It makes the child view the parent as warm and fun, which is going to improve behavior. It improves learning in many domains, especially speech and language. I mean, if we didn't have play, we'd be in really big trouble as SLPs, you know, and quality of life, right? So that was a really important one to cover. The other thing we covered in that session was tangible positive reinforcement. So this was essentially giving not only praise, which we know is really good, but also sometimes you need a little extra something, right? So giving them an object or an activity that they really like as a reward for good behavior. So we gave, the parents all made reinforcement menus of choices of things that their kids could do after they finished a particularly difficult task or routine. And then the last few, we talked about functional communication training. So for the function of a behavior, that attention escape sort of thing. occurring in a given situation, we want to teach the children to use a communicative message that serves that same purpose. So, instead of I'm going to throw this puzzle piece at my sister's head to get her attention and get her to play with me, maybe we'll teach the kid to say, let's play instead. And then actively ignoring and positively redirecting minor problem behavior. So this is now another consequence strategy. So this is essentially redirecting the child back to a task or the use of language without providing a lot of negative or positive attention, which is easier said than done. I use this Easter Island guy to demonstrate what I want the parent's face to look like while they're redirecting their child back to task. So we talked a lot about stone face. Basically, no eye contact, no kind of either mad or happy expression, just a very neutral expression. And then in session 13, we learned about errorless learning. So in terms of teaching new adaptive skills, so encouraging their learning success by providing prompts to make sure that they're successful and to ensure that they respond correctly each time. And of course, if we do it that way, then that also gives us way more opportunities to positively reinforce the adaptive behavior. And then in our last session, we had parent presentations where they actually presented on their generalization project routine, a review game, and some wrap up. We also had a barbecue. I did get some really good generalization project routine presentations. So some, parents followed in what I was doing and they gave a PowerPoint with before and after videos. I had one set of parents who did a puppet show that was hilarious. I had another one who basically did role play, which I felt was quite cathartic for the dad who was acting out how his daughter was behaving. I got the sense that was really fun for him. So they really put a lot of effort in, these parents. I was very, very proud of them all the way through. So I thought I'd just go through an outline of a typical session, just so you kind of know what was happening. So each of the sessions were 2.5 hours. They typically started with a home practice review and celebrations of success. So we definitely want to celebrate success. We want to give lots of positive reinforcement about what parents were doing, but this was also to encourage accountability. So if you know that you have to come to your session and that session is going to start with, I have to share how it went this week, then you're probably going to be a little more likely to actually complete the home practice. The other thing I would sometimes do with that was I would get, if there was a mom and a dad, I would get mom to share something about that she saw dad doing that was really fantastic, and then in turn get dad to share something great about what mom was doing, so that we're also building more praise and more positivity between parents as well. Then we would do a 5-minute mindfulness practice, one of those 4 I was talking about earlier. We would have some sort of cognitive behavior therapy strategy. So this would be disputing or accepting or reframing unhelpful thoughts, affirmations, those kinds of things. And then we would have 1 to 2 PBS strategies taught via an active training approach. And that's what I was talking about earlier with the Parent Management Training Oregon model. So there was didactic information, but not too much of it. We also had lots of examples and non-examples and videos and demonstrations and role play. And then take-home messages, which was something we built in after the pilot study because parents really wanted that and I thought it was a great idea. I'm not sure why I didn't do it the first time, actually. And then an introduction of the new home practice assignment. And I wouldn't just kind of hand that to them. We would work on it for 5 to 10 minutes so that they weren't faced with this blank, thing that they needed to do when they got home. They actually started thinking about what they were going to do and how they were going to apply that day's strategy to their particular routine before they left. I also have this guy, this coffee, making a break for it. Do you get it? Coffee break. So we definitely always had a coffee break in there, because, and what would happen during that time, obviously to, give people a break, but it was also me and the research assistant would actually leave the room, and this allowed parents a little bit of bonding time with one another, which of course was really, really good for them. And they really enjoyed that part of it. So just a few tips then for parent training using an active training approach. I have just a few written down here, and they really are the ones that I tended to use the most. But if you look at the Parent Management Training Oregon model, I think there's about 20 something of these strategies that you can use while parent training. And I actually filled out a checklist at the end of each session about which ones I had used that day, just to kind of keep my mind in like what I should be doing with the parents in each group. So definitely promoting balance of participation amongst group members. You have really chatty people and you have really quiet people, but making sure that everybody has a chance to contribute is really important. Using humor, I mean, that's something we know helps people be engaged and learn better. And that's something that comes fairly naturally to me, thank goodness. So I think it does really help. Encouraging and supporting via positive reinforcement. So we're basically modeling what we want the parents to be doing at home with their kids, right? So you can see in that picture there, I have one of my research assistants was named Sarah, and she had Sarah's bucket of fun. So, she would basically, there were reinforcers in there. We had potato chips and pens, and it varied from week to week. But whenever parents would do something fantastic, she would get up, give them, verbal praise, and give them something out of the bucket, which was, I think parents really enjoyed that. Normalizing parent experiences. I did a little bit of that, but the parents did a lot of that for each other. And I think that really went a long way to reducing stress, knowing that, like a parent would share something that they felt was quite horrific that their child did, and somebody else would be like, oh, my kid used to do that all the time, right? He doesn't do that anymore. I mean, that was really helpful for parents. Mirroring and matching parent behavior, reflecting what they've said, and interrupting supportively. I mean, all of these things, honestly, I'm still working on. All of the things that were on that checklist in terms of process, I'm still working on. I'm sure I will continue to work on them, but this one was really hard. So you really have to, if you're going to cover the amount of material that you need to kind of get through in a session, you have to get good at interrupting supportively. I mean, these are parents who now they get to talk about how bad their kid is and how frustrating it is, and they have a captive audience, and so they can really run with that. And you want a little bit of that, but it can go a little bit too far. And so me learning how to interrupt them and bring it back to the task was something that I really had to work on a lot, for sure. And then, homemade baking and good coffee didn't hurt either. So I made cookies or cake or whatever every session. The dads in particular, I think, really liked that. But all of these things, the baking and the coffee breaks and the active training and all of these process elements, essentially what we're trying to do is enhance learning and motivation, so that parents will be super into the program and they'll be more likely to carry out what they need to do at home. So we've kind of covered the actual program itself now. I'm going to cover more of the other aspects of the research. So we did have a total of 12 families who participated through to the end of assessment 2. I'll talk about what that is in a minute. 11 participated in the intervention. The kids, they all had a diagnosis of Down syndrome. They were between 4 and 7 years old at the start of the study, and they had mild to moderate problem behavior for at least 6 months. And 3 of the kids also had a diagnosis of autism, along with the Down syndrome. So for parents, they had to be willing to complete assessments. And you'll see in a minute, it was a lot of assessments. I apologized a lot over the course of that year to parents about how much I was making them do. So they had to be willing to do that, to attend all the weekly sessions and complete the home practice assignments. Both parents were meant to participate. If it was a two-parent family, I still think that's really important. Both parents were fluent in oral and written English, and that the parents were not diagnosed with a mental health condition, and they were within normal limits of parenting stress. So in case you were wondering about what kinds of problem behavior we saw, here's the classic, the Down syndrome classic. Okay, so this is the sit down strike shown 3 ways. Otherwise known affectionately by parents as the drop and flop. So this was definitely a common type of behavior we saw, and it fit into that non-compliance category, right? That kind of, either kids would do this, or they would say no, or they would yell, or they would turn their back on their parent. Or often when parents asked them to do something, they would engage in some kind of silly, cute, charming behavior, which is another favorite of kids with Down syndrome to get out of doing the task, right? So in terms of function of behavior, across the routines that parents chose, there are basically most of them engaged in largely attention-seeking behavior, but lots of them also engaged in escape-driven behavior. So those were the 2 most common functions we saw. So here's how it all shook down in terms of where everybody went. So that the 12 families were randomly assigned to 2 groups. One was the experimental group. The second was the waitlist control group. And I split those. Oh, you'll see that in the waitlist control group, it's actually an uneven number, and that's because I had 1 single mom in that particular group. And I split both of them again because I felt like having 12 people in a room was too much for a newbie parent trainer like me. So I ended up splitting them into a Wednesday evening and a Saturday morning group. And then in that waitlist control group, you'll see that one of the families had to drop out because dad couldn't actually attend the sessions anymore. So they only did 3 of the sessions, and then they had to drop out. But that still yielded at a retention rate of, I think, 92%. And we see from research literature that most parent training programs have a retention rate of around 50%. So that's pretty good. So we used a randomized controlled trial, which is, an experiment, a study design that you break them up into this, experimental group and the control group. And that should, because it's randomized, that should be able to allow us to attribute any changes to the actual program and not to other variables such as characteristics of individuals or that kind of thing. So we can be confident that if there's a change in the experimental group after they've had an intervention, it was actually due to the intervention. So this whole thing from phase 1 through to the end of phase 3 took place over about 11 months. So from January to close to into December of 2018. The O's represent assessment points. So those were about 6-week periods of me giving out questionnaires, getting them back, driving around the Lower Mainland, going to all their houses to videotape their routines a couple times. And then these X's were the actual group parent training program. And those were 14-week, that was the 14-week program that I just talked about. And then, so for dependent variables, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So we had the main ones that I want you to focus on are these bolded ones. So these are the ones where I did direct observation. So we looked at whether parents were, the percentage of strategies they were using correctly. We looked at child problem behavior in a primary routine. Parents chose that primary routine that we looked at. They did that before the study started. And the way they did that was I asked them if we could get one routine in your life functioning more smoothly, and it would make a big difference to your quality of life as human beings, what would that be? And most parents could immediately say, oh, for sure, the witching hour, before dinner, where the child is playing with her siblings and I'm trying to cook dinner. Or they would say, oh, bedtime is awful, or I hate taking him to the grocery store, but I really need to take him there. So parents were able to pick that quite easily. So in that routine, when I videotaped it, we looked at their problem behavior. So the percentage of time they were engaging in problem behavior, and then also their positive engagement in the routine. So what percentage of time were they positively engaged in doing what they were supposed to be doing, or engaged in, somewhat neutral behavior that went along with the routine. And then just in terms of indirect observation measures, these were all parent report questionnaires. So we had a couple of generalization measures. So, does it carry over to other routines? There was another checklist of child behavior, a sense of parenting competence, parenting stress, family quality of life, and social validity, which I'll talk about a little bit. So I'll go through the results now. Here's one of our dudes who's looking much more happy on his walk. Actually, both he and dad are looking much happier than the first time I videotaped them, that's for sure. So I'll have a big swig of coffee, but I will only show you 3 graphs, I promise. Just for those of you who are statistical nerdy people, I had to use non-parametric analyses for all of this stuff because we had a really small N. But in these graphs, you'll see we'll start with the parent implementation fidelity. So this is their use of strategies. You will see that green line represents the experimental group. The blue line represents the waitlist control group. Along the bottom, we have the time of observation, so assessment 1, 2, and 3. And then along this side, we have the percentage of correct use of strategies. So basically, you can see that they start quite low together here, both groups. After intervention, the experimental group went up to about using 80% of them well, whereas these guys stayed about the same. But after they had the intervention, they also came up. And I would say, most of the strategies were used much better by parents by the end. But the one that was consistently hard, I think only about 30% of parents were using it correctly even after intervention, was the actively ignore and positively redirect minor problem behavior. So we saw a lot of this, what's in this picture. So, basically moms or dads still comforting the child. A lot of times though, it wasn't comforting, it was negative attention, like don't do that kind of thing. I did though have one mom who sent me a picture of her practicing this strategy. So this is her. She sent me this by text and she said, here I am, I'm actively ignoring, I'm practicing, which was very good. So moving into the child problem behavior in that primary routine. So you can see, again, the same thing. The experimental group is green. Waitlist control group is blue. Along the side now, we now have percentage of intervals with problem behavior. And you can see here, they started out very much the same again, the 2 groups. But the experimental group, the green guys, dropped down after intervention. So they went from 40 something to 15-ish, right? And these guys didn't even stay the same. Hopefully you can see it, but actually it was getting worse over time. And we know that that can happen with kids with developmental disabilities and problem behavior. It doesn't just disappear because they've gotten older. Sometimes it gets worse. Often it gets worse. So again, this was a statistically significant difference at assessment 2, when one had the program and one hadn't yet. And then a similar pattern again for child engagement. So again, the 2 groups kind of start out about the same. These guys have their intervention and they're engaging in their routine much more often than they were before. And these guys, again, you can see a little bit, this waitlist control group, before they have intervention, they're not going in the right direction. Okay, so again, we have a significant difference there at assessment 2, but you can see that the waitlist control group comes up and joins after they've had intervention. So all in all, very positive results. And you can see some examples here photographic evidence of positive engagement after the routines were done, after the intervention was done, sorry. And just, you guys might be wondering, you know, about how did the children with the dual diagnosis fare? So I've got along the bottom here, we've got problem behavior and positive engagement. We have along the bottom, we have the group as a whole. So, you know, what they were doing right before the intervention and what they were doing right after the intervention. And you can see these three families, all of whom had a kid who was dually diagnosed, did quite well, right? They did around the same, you know, average as the group. Actually, these two were kind of superstars, right? So, I mean, I would like to say that if your child is engaging in, you know, really not very much problem behavior, only 8% of the time in a really tough routine, I would say most parents, whether you have a child with a disability or not, would be pretty happy about that number. That's not too bad. So basically, the kids with Down syndrome and autism together did really well, which I was very happy about. So just a bit about social validity. We had high social validity scores for both moms and dads. So they found the program to be acceptable and feasible and, most importantly, useful. And all parents reported that they would recommend the program to others. And you'll see, just I put a few of the parent comments in here. They weren't all positive, and I was happy about that too, because then, you know, I know what to do to improve things later on. So like one dad said he didn't really click with the mindfulness exercises. We also asked parents to talk about what accomplishments they were most proud of, and parents said things like, you know, I was really happy to see her just engaging and participating fully in all of her routines. That was really wonderful. Being able to take my child places without anxiety, that was one of my favorite comments. So definitely a positive response overall. A couple of other results, because I didn't want to, you know, go through 8 bazillion graphs, but the family functioning variables like the stress and those kinds of things included decreased stress, improved parenting competence, and improved family quality of life for moms, but not for dads. So very interesting. And we also found improved behavior in one additional generalization routine. So it was that project routine that they ended up presenting in class. That was the one that they did better in. Also, there was robust improvement in that one, actually. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos now. I'm just going to make sure that I can share my sound. Pat, will you let me know if you can't hear it?
Yes, I will let you know.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start playing it. So this first little dude is, he was 6 when this first clip was taken. He is a little guy who has just Down syndrome. His mom had a lot of trouble with grocery shopping. You're going to see, I know I talked a lot about attention and escape behavior, but for this little dude, you're going to see a lot of tangibly driven behavior. But hey, it's a grocery store and there's lots of things that can be grabbed in a grocery store. And so you're going to see a lot of that with him. And then on the mom side, you're going to see a lot of reprimanding and rationalization for her.
Turn it up.
Okay.
No hitting, okay? Put your hands up. Come with mom. Oh, let's go. Yeah, that's the freezer. That's the freezer. Come. No, you can't go sit in the freezer. Brody, you need to get out. Come. No, it's too cold for ice. I don't need ice. Brody. You listen to mama? Back up. No, we're not going to start that, okay? Close it. No, we don't need that. You put that back down. We don't need that, okay? No, put that back down. Listen. No, we don't need that, Road. Come, you have to carry on. What? What are you looking at? Come, you need to go. We need to carry on. No, this is all for older people. Come.
Okay, so for this little guy after intervention, you'll see that mom is using 3 strategies really well. I mean, she used a bunch of strategies, but you'll see 3 in this clip. One of them was a setting event strategy. So basically, we've figured out that this little dude really liked to help. And so having him push the cart, having him put things in the cart was really helpful. You'll see him using a visual support in the form of his own grocery list, and then some enthusiastic praise by mom.
Oh, you put that one in? Very cool. Yeah, you put these 2 of them, see? One, another one. We got the red one too. Very careful because they can break, eh? Oh, you're being gentle. Awesome, bro. Look at, yeah. Wow. Good job. Pretty good, bro. Come.
So I know those are really, really short clips, but I hope you can see that mom and her son have now a much more positive interactions happening. You probably saw a lot of eye contact between them, like checking. He was checking with her. He kind of cared about what she was thinking about his, what was going on, and that they definitely, she was way less stressed. She sounded a lot happier in that second clip. Hopefully that came through. So I'll show you one other family. So family 9 was actually a child who, it was another little dude, and he had a dual diagnosis of Down syndrome and autism spectrum disorder. And this one, he's a 5-year-old little guy, and the selected routine was parent was busy, mom was trying to cook dinner, and this little guy was playing with his older sister and his younger brother. And what you'll see in the before clip is a whole lot of him engaging in his preferred activity, which is essentially a full body tackle aimed at his siblings in order to knock them to the ground. You'll also see that mom is only coming in the room, and again, it's a really short clip, but I'll just tell you, she only comes in the room after he's engaged in problem behavior. And just pay attention to the rapt expression on his face when she comes in the room.
Did Isaac push you? Yeah, Isaac. Did you push David? Yeah. No, no. He did it again. This time it didn't hurt me. Yeah. You need to stop, Isaac, okay? Yeah. You want to go have time out in your room? Yeah. Yeah?
Okay, so boy, he had really figured out a good way of getting his mom to come in the room, that's for sure. So in this clip, you're going to see this was the family where we needed an extra strategy, so in the form of a visual support. So mom is now using a social story at the beginning of the routine to outline expectations for him, outline other activities he can do, remind him of other things he can do besides knocking his siblings to the ground. You'll also see her providing a choice to him at one point. You'll see he's playing much better than he was. It's not just kind of, engaging in automatic reinforcement behavior and the problematic behavior of knocking his siblings to the ground. Now he's actually playing. His older sister was quite helpful in teaching him those skills, which was great. And then you'll see at the end, mom giving really enthusiastic praise. and some incorporating preferences in the form of a house rules ticket.
Okay. When
Mom.
cooks, I can
Ah.
with and
Damn it.
Adi and David. We play hide and
Seek.
hide it.
Okay, your turn to hide, and I'll count. 1, 2.
Do you want waves or do you want music? Music?
Yeah. Yeah. Put it.
This is Isaac. Blue is Isaac's favorite color, right?
Last.
Right. I kept my hands and body to myself.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
It's just amazing to me how excited kids get about a piece of paper in a jar. Okay, so some unique contributions of this research to the literature. Family-centered positive behavior support for families of children with Down syndrome hadn't been studied yet at any tier. This was the first one to do a secondary prevention or tier 2 model of family-centered positive behavior support rather than on an individualized basis in research. And because of that, it was also the first study to use an RCT to examine FC-PBS intervention. So the main clinical implication here being that this kind of secondary prevention model aimed at families who have young children who are just starting to engage in some problem behavior, this kind of mild to moderate range, appears to be promising. And this is especially true considering the cost of tertiary, that individualized support versus this kind of parent training support. And particularly for this population who do not typically receive behavioral supports. So if you got just a couple of limitations as well. So obviously we can't extrapolate these results to all families of young children with Down syndrome. There were only 12 families in this study and only 11 completed the intervention. And the fact that the parent training was not as effective for fathers as it was for moms with respect to some of those family functioning variables. And so in order to, we'd like to study this more, but maybe in some other centers across Canada that service kids with Down syndrome. But before we do that, we have to enhance training on that actively ignore and positively redirect strategy that was really tough for parents to learn. Probably doing it earlier in the program is going to be really important. And then some amendments to improve benefits for dads as well. So I'm going to finish off on this slide and then you're welcome to ask me questions. This was just a collateral effect that was really lovely for me. Kids with Down syndrome often have a lot of trouble actually making and maintaining friendships, as with kids with autism for sure. But two of the families in my study happened to live quite close to one another. And so they became friends, these two little guys. And with that, I will stop my sharing and please ask me questions.